Well, welcome back for another round. So I want to continue to talk a little bit about f-stops and depth of field. And you see here I have a little equation. What determines the f-stop is the focal length of the lens divided by the aperture diameter. And that is how we arrive at an f-stop. That being said, focal length of lens is really important in this, and that is one of the things that determines the extent of depth of field. These three things determine the extent of depth of field. We already know that f-stop or aperture extends the depth of field. If we had if we're using f22, we have the greatest extent of depth of field. Two other things that determine that. One is the focal length of the lens. The longer the lens gets, the less depth of field that we have. So if we have a very long lens, we have a very narrow depth of field. It may only be inches or a foot or so. If we, of course, if we have a wide angle lens, 28 millimeter, 17 millimeter, we have a very extended depth of field. And it does not take a very large aperture to get everything into focus, even if you're focusing on something close up and a landscape at infinity. Also, we have lens to subject distance. The closer that we move to an object, and especially if we're using a longer lens, the closer we move to it, our depth of field even gets smaller. So the mix is very difficult, especially photographing macro style imagery. If we're photographing flowers close up, we're going to find that unless we use a very deep depth of field, f22, f32, and even special lenses that may go beyond f32, it's really important to have a greater depth of field when photographing close up, subject to distance. Of course, as we move back away from things, we have a greater depth of field. So these three things help determine it. Now, I'll give you an example. So here's our camera up here, and our camera, the focal plane where our CCD lies, is exactly 10 feet away from our little guy here. And like I said, the lens can only focus at one point at a time. As we get closer to the camera and the lens and move away from it, what occurs is that the images, and not certainly the image of the figure here, but anything that's in front of it, if there was a tree branch, an object, a car, in front of them, and we were photographing from this point, it would become out of focus, as well as trees in the background or mountains that are further away. And what we want to do is extend our depth of field. Now, hypothetically, if we had an aperture setting of, let's say, f5.6, our depth of field might be from the front of his toe to the back of his toe at 5.6. If we extend that to f11 or f16, our depth of field, and that's all depends on the focal length of our lens, of course, we may have a greater depth of field. So things could become in focus. If we went up to f22, everything maybe from 5 feet to the mountains at infinity could be in focus in our image by choosing a smaller diaphragm hole in our camera, the aperture size f-stop that we would call maybe f22. So this is a little bit about how depth of field works. Now we can use that to our advantage. If we were taking a portrait of this person and it was a close-up of their face, we might want the background to blur out. So we might want to use a smaller f-stop number. If we're trying to get everything in focus for a particular reason, sometimes in portraiture it's nice to have blurred backgrounds. It helps us focus our eye on the portrait of the person. But sometimes if we're taking photos of a big fair, we want everything in focus, all the people, all the acts, all the activities that are going on. So think about how we use our apertures, and when we combine them together with ISO ratings and shutter speeds, we come up with primo imagery that tells our story and captures the things that we feel are important. All right, see you next time.